So my name's Greig Holbrook. I'm the founder of an agency that specialises in international digital marketing. And I founded the agency about 13 years ago. My background, interestingly enough, was as a lecturer at Brighton University. So it's really good to be in front of you all today because it really brings back how I started off on my route. I started my master's at Brighton University at the same time, and I was always fascinated on the web from an international perspective. I knew then that the way the web was developing wasn't really catering for second language speakers of English. When I did my master's, I quoted heavily a guy called David Crystal, who some of you may or may not know, but he said at the time, in order for people to use the internet properly, they're going to have to speak English. And I knew that was nonsense, to be honest. So I came out of being a lecturer and I started the company, as I say, 12 years ago. I also knew to be able to do this correctly, you need to have people in market. So when I set out on my mission to set up the company, we created teams in market in over 45 countries. You might be thinking about the name. So I just want to go on from Lawrence's question. My name is a bit of a silly one. I was sitting there one day and I thought, I want something that's not really web-based that sticks in the mind. And I found the town Oban in Scotland. I thought that's quite an interesting name, quite an interesting place. And then I found the one in Australia, or New Zealand actually. And I thought, that's a very interesting part of someone that was pioneering. They'd left the town in Scotland and they'd gone to the part in New Zealand and they'd set up. And if you measure the distance, it's a long way apart. So that's the name out of the way. So today I'm going to talk about global social media. And it still is a hot topic. But I think we can't dispute the fact that it's a fundamental part of how we do business digitally. So first of all, why do we bother with social media? Well, there's all sorts of reasons. It increases our exposure. It's another channel that we didn't have a few years ago. It's obviously increases our traffic, develops loyalty, insights. Data is so important in the digital marketing industry, and this gives us another insight into how people are behaving, what they're looking for, and what they're looking to do. And it even leads into direct sales, which I'm going to come on to. Being an international business, what we look at is the way that people use social media in different markets, and it is very fascinating. So this is some data from Google, and you'll see here for the German market that social media is often the first touch point for them in making a purchase later on down the line. Now, if you follow that journey, you'll see after that they need to see a display click. Then they need to see organic search, SEO, then followed by brand paid search before they go direct or to a marketplace. If you looked at country to country, you would find that every country and every culture responds differently to social media, but it's always involved in the channel. The other point is that these are all attributable to a sale in e-commerce. It's very unlikely, and the things might change in the future, to have one touch point on one sale. It's more often that you have multiple touch points, many influences that lead to that person eventually buying from you. So social media creates brand awareness, it creates consideration through remarketing, it creates retention. Social media is probably one of the best ways of keeping that customer loyal to you. And advocacy. So you want people that are buying your product, sharing it with their friends, and that creates other consumers. And we're talking about networks here. So we move from awareness through consideration, purchase, retention, and advocacy. And it's like a cycle, if we get it right, that keeps coming on. So first of all, the user is interested in considering the purchase, and they'll do their research. And that might be through social media, or it might be through natural search or paid search. They then want to check the credibility of the product, read opinions about it, and then they start asking questions, engaging with your channels and seeking out offers and bargains. And then having purchased, again, they need to share that, you hope, with a positive feedback to their network and to the wider network as well. So there's multiple touch points. Where social media can sit in the digital marketing space is in content. We have the earn space, which is talking about PR, outreach and social shares. The own space, which is more about your own content that you share, blogs, etc., email, and then the paid space. So the paid channel for social has really grown in the last few years. many agencies like ours are running paid social campaigns all over the world. And it's great that anything that takes on something like Google is a good thing for me. I think any competition is an amazing thing. But what a lot of people do when they launch these campaigns is they don't know enough about their users. They don't know enough about behaviours. So what I'm going to talk about today is understanding some of the behaviours that are happening in other parts of the world and comparing them with each other. And you'll see that to do this correctly, you have to be very forensic. So local accounts can send regional content and products. So that allows people to know exactly where to go, where your content is hosted, and it can outstrip the kind of potential of global content. So you've got things on LinkedIn there, Google+, Twitter, Pinterest, all signposting regional content. And it also leads to good and meaningful conversations. So around 30% of the digital media budget now is being spent on social. And with Facebook, you can target 25 countries plus. With Twitter, it's over 200. So they recognize the power of expanding their reach into these different markets, but it brings up loads of questions. How do you communicate? Do you communicate in English? Do you have local accounts? What's the best impact? But it's now worth over $30 billion, and it's probably going to increase quite significantly in the next couple of years. But again, so many people do this without thinking, without strategic knowledge of the users and the people they're trying to reach. So in every market around the world by 2017, as I mentioned, spend is going to increase and it's not going to go away. But what's going to happen is you're going to see more and more networks coming in, social media networks, which are more kind of specialist. They're going to challenge even the people like Facebook and other brands like that, because actually people might find the content on some of these networks a little bit generalist. So in the future, you're going to find disruptors coming in and taking some market share, but it's all set to grow. What's interesting about this data is that, in fact, in the UK and the US, we don't spend half as much time on social media as they do in other parts of the world. I mean, if you look at the Philippines, they're spending nearly 4 hours a day on social media, as in Brazil as well, Indonesia. So we're very far down, back down to the Japanese. So, as a company, we'll always look at these things market by market, because where you put your spend and you get your return is very important as to how much time people spend online in social networks and where they're spending their time as well. So the strategy for the Philippines would probably be different to the strategy for Italy, Poland, or Canada. So you may or may not know this, but there are many platforms out there which aren't the kind of ones that you're used to. Around the world, there are very much a local flavour to many social media networks, and they're holding their own. People still like to use them, they're familiar to them. So we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about Russia and China in particularly, and the kind of impact their social networks have. And those are kind of countries we work in a lot with our clients, and so we need to know what's happening market by market. So around the world, obviously Facebook dominates, in the Western world particularly, but as you start to go into Asia, you start to see a different picture. You start to see, this kind of Sina Weibo kind of picture, Q-zone, and you start to then look at how the retailers are starting to, particularly British retailers, are trying to position themselves on these different channels. So sometimes British is a common USP interest for retailers, especially for luxury or fashion. But in Russia, British doesn't really mean very much. English means a lot more. But it's a semantics issue, but the context makes a huge difference. So you need to have that local knowledge. How do you push British or do you push English? Or do you not push English or British at all on these networks when you're a retailer? Because actually that's not important. When you look like a brand like Clarks, and Lawrence mentioned them earlier on, there's a very different way that they portray themselves in social media between the UK and here we have in India. So what they have in India is very much playing on the aspirational brand, playing up the British brand heritage. And that can work very well for a lot of British retailers because there's a lot of kudos to that. But again, in the UK, it's more viewed as a high quality but practical footwear brand. So a different strategy is required depending on the countries that you're targeting. Even in Europe, it's not just about Facebook and Twitter. Xing and Video are very popular networks that you may or may not have come across. And that Video and Xing are very popular, just not in Germany, but France, where Video is from, Portugal, Russia, lots of South America. So there's a lot of complexities to digital social media marketing around the world that you need to get to the bottom of. Where's your audience hanging out? Where do you need to target them? And how do they respond? So let's look at China in more detail. I think this diagram really tells it all. You know, you have on the left-hand side the major networks. You've got Sina Web, Weibo, Renren, Tencent, Ozone, and you can see with their equivalents. So with WeChat, they're not far off the kind of numbers that WhatsApp is on. And through WeChat, you have a lot of social commerce, which I'm going to talk about later on. You have numbers that are very comparable in terms of Twitter and Facebook as well. And obviously, the Chinese market is set to grow. In many ways, we argue that the Chinese market is ahead of us. So if you put together LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, QQ has more users. Now, China's a tricky market, I would say. Any retailer that comes to us and says, we want to start with China, I'd say, well, are you really sure? Tmall marketplaces might be the first place you might go because, you know, there are all these complexities. And if you're selling internationally for the first time, there may be easier wins. It's something you might build up to, but no doubt about it, there's opportunities there. But it's just how sophisticated your strategy is to actually make the most of that. So as I mentioned, there's so much social commerce happening on WeChat. People make purchases, they hail taxis. Payment is a very big issue in e-commerce, as probably most of you know. And there are many disruptors coming into the market around the world who are trying to disrupt the traditional ways of payment to make it easier and easier for peer-to-peer buying. A thing called blockchain is happening in the fintech industry where banks are being cut out. And all of that has an impact, I think, on the way that e-commerce is going to be done in the future. So at the moment, you know, you can't transact on Facebook, but you know, they are behind the curve. But in the future, who knows? You may well be able to. So by 2016, this year, we've seen double the amount of transactions on WeChat compared to last year, which is a huge amount of change. It's not just a channel for making a decision or helping your decision, as we have a lot of our social media here, but it actually is one where you can purchase. And again, Lawrence mentions JD.com and places like that. You can see these are places where the Chinese go and are buying, you know, considerable amounts of goods. Russia is another interesting market. Before the sort of economic issues and the problems with petrol and gas, Russia had always been a target market. Again, very loyal to their own search engines. They use Yandex in China very much, but also their own social media networks, particularly Onika Klansky and vKontakte, as we'll go on to say. Now, when I started the company, Russia had very low internet penetration. It was very unsophisticated, and it's probably not still at the level that we are, but there are many merchants and e-commerce providers that do well even today into Russia. And the theory is that Russians still like to have that new item of clothing that their friend doesn't have, and how they're going to get that if they don't shop overseas. Yandex Market and places like that, there are many people on there looking for overseas buying, and the social media, fabric plays into all of that kind of stuff. So you've got 68.5 million people now who are active social media users in Russia, and that's about 50% of the total population. So it's still relatively low compared to some countries, but it's going to continue to grow, and I firmly believe that once the economic situation sorts itself out, it will grow quite fast again. So, here we have, this sort of steady growth in Russia where the internet population is very closely mirroring the social media penetration. And when they start to do that in Russia, again, they prefer their own platforms. They're well established, localized, And in Russia and places like that, there's a lot of trust in that kind of thing compared to outside networks. So with someone like vKontakte, it's the second largest network in Europe after Facebook. Okay, it's a long way behind Facebook, but it's important. You know, it's important to know that that is a place where people can access movies. There's a strong video sharing capability to it. And it's very much around content marketing is the objective when you're targeting vKontakte. And it's also popular in other markets like Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Belarus, and Israel as well. But it's very strict. So you can't use faces unless you have written approval. There's no alcohol or unacceptable diseases or injuries in category. It's catastrophe. How do you say that? Catastrophes. Thank you very much. One of those words. So anything like that. So you sometimes fall foul of the editors at vKontakte if you're not careful. No images of alcohol, including beer, abusive words. But once you get those kind of things, you know, sorted, you're able to work in that market. And it's kind of a must if you're doing social media advertising and marketing in the Russian country, in the Russian market. So in terms of usage, you can see that vKontakte and Onoklansky are way ahead of Facebook. And again, this may change, but you'll never find a place where they're not important. Sometimes you have to do multi-channel, as we do in the sort of English-speaking world. So it may not be a question of just doing one or the other. It's a question of having a slightly different strategy for one compared to the other. So there are also things that is very common in Russia are unofficial brand sites. Many retailers are very upset about that, and you know they try to take them down, they try to take action and that kind of stuff, and they're not regulated. And they're often viewed with suspicion, but they actually can be very positive. You know, the best actual way of doing it, if you feel that the people are selling genuine things, is to make a relationship with these guys and see, you know, how you can work together rather than actually jumping into the point of saying this is going to be a conflict and we're going to go to court to stop you doing what you're doing. Funnily enough, brand loyalty is very high with these kind of unofficial sites. And they're, you know, providing products that perhaps the actual e-commerce retailer or the manufacturer doesn't give in those countries. So they're actually in some ways providing a kind of service. So what you often see is that for the two different platforms, you know, for vKontakte and Facebook, that a lot of retailers have a different kind of strategy. They've got a different audience. So Facebook users in Russia tend to be older, more professional, and probably travelled around a little bit. And this is how social media and the internet can affect people's behaviours. If you've lived abroad or you've travelled abroad, you're likely to come back with that kind of behaviour of using something like Facebook. But if you spent more of your time in the Russian market, you're probably going to be more attuned to vKontakte. So you can see here where we've got some brands that are using both channels, but then you can also see people that just focus on one, and you can see that some people that just focus on Facebook. You know, the idea would be to really understand who your users are and, you know, what demographics they have, because with social media we do have a lot of data, and we can often find out, is that demographic using that social media platform in that particular market. ZARA as well has a VK page and a Russian Facebook page, but on VK there's also unofficial pages as well. But they kind of understand that, they've kind of accepted it, it isn't a massive problem for them, they kind of sit side by side. And for many cases it gives them an interesting idea as to what products could work that they're not currently selling direct. ZARA does very well at running competitions, polls and showcasing products and that kind of stuff. Another brand that you may or may not have heard of is Rozetka, which is a very popular Russian e-commerce brand. And they have a lot of fun with the Russian audience. They have a lot of things around social, community building, and they post amusing in inverted commas, random content. But it kind of shows you that as an appeal to the Russian audience. Getting humour right in international digital marketing is quite difficult, I think. But it just shows you that there is this love of something that is a bit different. It's not just about the product. It's kind of giving them a story. And the story brings them into these platforms, and then that allows them to sell. And I think that is one of the things about social media that is very important to know, is that those brands who just push themselves are far less interesting than those that have a story. And it's how they tell those stories in different markets can often dictate how successful they can be. So you can see there a guy sitting there with a husky, or it looks even bigger than a husky, but it looks a pretty big dog there. So when it comes to profiling your international audiences, you've got to do a lot of research. You've got to understand what platforms people are using, why do they use them? Are they actually interested in understanding about e-commerce, or is it much more of a social thing? And how do they behave? Do they share a lot of content? Do they spend a lot of time browsing? What kind of data is available for you? And what's it going to cost you to acquire them market by market? So again, putting it all into a plan, start with the audience always in any country and don't make assumptions. Social media is a bit like search engine marketing. People make loads of assumptions about the international nature of their audience, and they end up making mistake after mistake. So you use this as a roadmap to planning for social media, and understand that even by age and gender, we have this data available that shows us that people are consuming social media in different ways. So here's an example here. You can see this compares Brazil to the UAE. And we can see for Instagram, there's a big difference between the amount of time, or the percentage of people in Brazil, 16 to 24, that are using Instagram compared to the UAE. And those are percentages, but in our digital marketing space, you are talking about percentages. You're always looking to understand where the gains can be made. So a focus here would be very different from Brazil, the UAE, in terms of Instagram. And this, you look at this demographic as well. 16 to 24, is that a demographic that you'd want to be targeting? You can also look at the Twitter usage between Brazil and UAE. Quite different, to 20 to 25%. That will affect where you put your spend and how you tackle the market. I mentioned gender. Again, all this data is so fantastic and available to us. And you can see by platform that the UAE differs in terms of the amount of females that use Instagram compared to males. The amount of females in the UAE that use Instagram is far higher than the females in Russia. So all of this data you need to bring together, understanding the audience, to start planning out campaigns. From an e-commerce perspective, I come back to my first slide. What are you trying to achieve? Is it brand building? Is it engagement? Understanding that social media on its own is unlikely to lead to a sale, that you need to have natural search, you need to have paid media, you need to have probably email, content. All of these things will lead someone to actually buying from you. But again, knowing that if you are targeting females, then the amount of spend you put into the UAE probably might be different to Russia. And obviously in Russia, you have these other platforms coming in as well. So you have VK and you have Onakonklansky. So you need to bear that in mind. So the questions you need to ask yourself when you're launching a global social media campaign: do you want to use local language? If you do, consider local accounts or targeted messaging, because gated posting is no longer a feature on Facebook pages. Do you want to serve unique content to the local market? If you do, consider local accounts or targeted messaging. Do you want hubs, so that the display of your feed pages look uniform in one language? Again, consider local accounts. Have you got distinct audiences, objectives and messages for each of your locations? Then consider local accounts. Do you want to appear global, multiple conversations, languages and locations visible in one area? Then consider a global account. Now, it can seem quite complicated for people, but as always in marketing, the more targeted you are, the more success you're going to have, weighed against the kind of costs that are involved. You've always got to make that kind of correlation. So just to sum up, here are the differences between that discussion of being global versus local. So if you're global, it's easier to manage. The resources are cheaper. The reporting overhead's lower. You've got a better governance, because governance is an important point. Obviously, you know, it's a very tricky subject for some people to allow different people around the world to manage social media, and it feels like a bigger organisation. But you need global objectives. It needs to come from one central hierarchy and a centralised content flow. Qualified social media manager and global reporting. And again, what are you reporting on? What are your success measures? I still think in social media there is a lack of understanding about what social media should be valued on and should be, you know, measured against. And my argument would be, like in any of our digital marketing space, it should be attributed. We should be able to say 10% of my spend goes into that, which compares to social SEO, etc. So if you want to go local, obviously the messaging is much more localized. The timing of day. We run a lot of campaigns around the world, and it's so crucial. Obviously, people are on different time zones. They have different holidays around the world. Those kind of things are really important. The more you understand those nuances, the more impactful it's going to be, and then you'll get improved engagement wherever your audiences are. But you need both global and local objectives. So every market needs its own objective feeding into the global strategy, and the content flow needs to be localized. You probably do need a social media manager per market, which again starts to build up the resource. But when you start to think about how much money is being spent in terms of marketing, and also how much is being spent by some of these users, and you start to think to yourself, well, you know, there comes a point, is it worth it? You know, is there a business case for doing a more local strategy? By having people locally, you understand slight changes to the atmosphere, you know, the digital atmosphere, the news, the buying behaviours, the latest trends, and it allows probably a better governance structure because people are more fluid on the ground. So it's a big topic, and I hope what I've done is given you a flavour of the opportunity, the rise, and also the diversification of channels across the world, and also the kind of segmentations that you need to consider, that market to market things do work differently. But without a doubt, you know, it's here to stay, and you know, any e-commerce provider, any travel provider that's online, it doesn't take this seriously and doesn't track it seriously, is probably missing a huge trick. So it's great to be back in front of an audience. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that was useful.